Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Perfect Sword, Forging the Dark Ages, by Paul Gething and Edoardo Albert. Narrated by Michael Langan. Introduction. Finding the Bamburgh Sword. Archaeology comes out of the ground. Tutankhamun was interred in a pyramid in Egypt. Knossos was found under a hill on Crete. The Staffordshire hoard was dug from a field in the county that named it. Not the perfect sword. This sword, the sword that, of all the thousands of blades ever forged, comes closest to being perfect, this sword came out of a suitcase. Admittedly, when the perfect sword was taken from the suitcase, it was a long way from being perfect. It was broken. It had no hilt either, just the tang, the extension of the blade that fits into the hilt, and the top half of the sword. In the normal course of events, archaeological finds come out of the ground because context is key. The foundation upon which archaeology lies is that older is deeper. This draws on the much older geological concept of superposition, which was first postulated in 1669 by Nicholas Steno and later popularized by William Strata Smith. If something is beneath, it must be earlier. There are exceptions to this. Someone digging or laying foundations might cut through the other older layers, introducing a newer element deeper underground. But the principle is clear. Underneath is older. In the context of archaeology as science, this is crucial. For one of the core elements of the scientific method is that experiments must be replicable and repeatable. But you can't do that with archaeology. A dig dug is done. You can't put all the finds back and have another go. Each excavation is unique and singular. On the face of it, this prevents archaeology being a true science, since no dig is repeatable. Yes, archaeology might employ all sorts of cutting-edge scientific techniques, isotopic analysis, statistical modeling, dendrochronology, carbon dating, but at its heart are non-repeatable, non-replicable excavations. By strict Popperian criteria, archaeology is not a science. Archaeology becomes a science by recording. Modern archaeology, as a scientific discipline, rests upon making a complete record of the excavation and a painstakingly accurate description of the context of each find. That is, each find is recorded in place, geographically, and in time, vertically. Its history determined by where it lies in the time sequence uncovered as the archaeologists slowly remove each layer of the past. Thus, while no dig can be repeated, the evidence and chain of inferences that lead to each find being dated and placed into history can be checked by any other archaeologist going through the excavation reports. Findings can be assessed and, if necessary, corrected. In the modern era, many sites have been re-investigated, and there is even a small subset of sites where the spoil heaps of previous excavations have been themselves excavated to recover evidence missed initially, from Stonehenge through to Hadrian's Wall. With this being the case, it would seem that a sword in a suitcase could be nothing more than a curiosity. On its own, it tells us no more than the brute fact of its existence, unmoored to any place or time. The story of how the sword came to be in the suitcase is a saga in itself. We now know that it was excavated from Bamburgh Castle, Northumberland, in 1970. The archaeologist who found it was named Brian Hope Taylor, and when he found the sword, he was at the peak of his professional and public life. Hope Taylor, with his sweep of blonde hair and penchant for driving around the countryside in sports cars, was a major figure among the first generation of professional archaeologists. He had served in the Second World War in the RAF before beginning to dig in the 1950s. Hope Taylor had also trained as an artist. Some of his paintings are held at Wolfson College, Cambridge. But like so many of his contemporaries, he learned the skills of excavation by digging. It was his excavation of Ad Gefren during the 1950s, the site of a palace of the Northumbrian kings, that made his name. The site itself is a field beneath a hill called Yevering Bell, which has the tumble-down remains of an Iron Age hill fort girdling its summit. The hill fort is visible. The remains of Ad Gefrin, which were all constructed from wood, are not. Yet from his delicate excavations, Hope Taylor extracted the layout of a number of extraordinary structures that he tied into the history of the Kingdom of Northumbria. For Bede tells us that in AD 627, the Italian missionary Paulinus went with King Edwin of Northumbria and his wife Ethelba to Ad Gefrin, and there preached the new religion to the Northumbrians, baptizing many hundreds in the nearby River Glen. At Ad Gefrin, Hope Taylor found the remains of timber buildings, including a great hall that was 26 meters, 85 feet, long, kitchens, weaving shed, a huge corral to hold cattle or horses brought in tribute to the king from the surrounding hills, and a grandstand with banks of elevated seating. Hope Taylor placed Paulinus, preaching the new religion, at the focus of this grandstand. Archaeology provides sections through time in a particular place. History tells the story of what happened. At Ad Gefrin, Hope Taylor brought the historical story and the archaeological snapshot together. His report of the excavation, Yevering, an Anglo-British centre of early Northumbria, became an archaeological classic, marrying precise excavation with an imaginative entry into the past, illustrated by Hope Taylor's exquisite drawings. However, the fact that the dig report was only published in 1977, more than 20 years after excavations had finished, highlights an ongoing problem in archaeology. Many archaeologists find it very difficult to complete the final report on an excavation with which they have become identified. Indeed, Yevering would prove to be Hope Taylor's first and last complete excavation report. Despite the many years' work he also did at Old Windsor in Berkshire and Doon Hill in Scotland, he never finished another report. However, Hope Taylor had made most of his findings about Ad Gefrin public long before publication, having presented a report on the excavation to the Society of Antiquaries and written his PhD on the dig. Indeed, his work was so highly rated that Hope Taylor was made a lecturer in archaeology at Cambridge University on the back of his excavations at Ad Gefrin, despite never having done an undergraduate degree himself. Among the many sites that Hope Taylor never wrote up was Bamburgh Castle. He excavated there in 2 phases, from the late 1960s to the early 1970s. He had left his excavation incomplete, but clearly expected to return and finish digging, for when the site was re-excavated in the early 2000s, the archaeologists found the section grids and marker tags still there, under the ground. Hope Taylor had simply covered them over with tarpaulins and plastic sacking and backfilled the site. Standard practice among archaeologists when leaving a site at the end of the season and expecting to return next year. But Hope Taylor never returned to Bamburgh. In the 1960s, he had become the public face of archaeology, presenting 2 successful TV series which highlighted his gifts as a communicator. He had been a child actor and took to the medium as one born. He was on the verge of becoming a major figure in British public life. Instead, he withdrew, first from public life, then from teaching, finally from his home in Cambridge, going to Wooler in Northumberland. After a bout of ill health, he subsequently returned to Cambridge, but did not resume his archaeological work, instead devoting his last years to the study of old churches in Essex. When Hope Taylor died in 2001, one of his old students went to his house to see what there was of archaeological interest in it. Ian Ralston had first dug with Hope Taylor as a boy in Scotland at the Doon Hill site near Dunbar, and had gone on to become a leading archaeologist in his own right. Ralston had done his best to remain in contact with Hope Taylor, even during his final decade, when Hope Taylor was consciously withdrawing from human society. Ralston arrived at Hope Taylor's house to find that it had become the depository of a lifetime of archaeology. It was stacked with boxes and files and finds. Even the bed was covered, leaving no room for someone to sleep. Hope Taylor had become a hoarder. But it was a hoard of the greatest archaeological interest. To sort, catalogue, and preserve it, Ralston enlisted another of Hope Taylor's old students, Diana Murray, who worked for the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland, RCA HMS. Arriving just in time to stop house clearers consigning Hope Taylor's muddled but invaluable archive to a waiting skip, Murray arranged for the contents of his house and a leaking garage that held finds Hope Taylor could not fit into his house to be taken to Edinburgh for conservation and sorting, which was where Paul Gething and the archaeologists of the Bamburgh Research Project, BRP, come into the story. They had begun digging at Bamburgh Castle in 1997. In 1998, Graham Young, one of the 4 founders of the BRP, along with Paul, Rosemary Whitbread, and Phil Wood, contacted Hope Taylor to ask what he had found when he had excavated the castle 25 years earlier and how large an area he had excavated. However, Hope Taylor proved evasive and unwilling to provide many details on what he had found. And what details he did provide turned out to be inflated. For instance, he claimed to have excavated all of the west ward of the castle, but the BRP later found that he had only dug 10% of it. Faced with this stonewalling from Hope Taylor, the BRP archaeologists advertised in and around Bamburgh, asking if anyone remembered what areas the Hope Taylor excavations had investigated. Many people came forward. One of the castle's tour guides had worked on the dig as a boy and showed the BRP where Hope Taylor had excavated. Another lady brought them a set of photographs of the site that Hope Taylor had asked her to look after, but had never returned to collect. The castle custodian also showed the archaeologists the storerooms that Hope Taylor had used during his excavations. These had been closed after he left the site and not reopened. Unsealing the door, the archaeologists found themselves faced with a nascent archaeological site, Hope Taylor's field office, untouched since he had left it, with desk, tools, soil samples, and some finds. But the reopened office held none of Hope Taylor's site reports, so they could not trace what he had done. Then the phone rang. It was someone from the RCA HMS, telling them that Hope Taylor had died, which they knew, and that the committee had taken possession of his archive, which they did not know. Would they like to come up to Edinburgh to see if there was anything relevant to their excavations at Bamburgh? Yes, they would like to, very much. So, not long afterwards, Paul and some of the other archaeologists drove to Edinburgh, where they were taken into a large room containing the many boxes, files, cases, bags, and crates that held Brian Hope Taylor's life work. On first seeing the spread of items and the complete lack of legible labelling, it seemed that finding anything relevant to their excavations at Bamburgh would be impossible. But looking through the boxes, Paul spotted a box containing items with the stratigraphy he had been digging at the castle. The stratigraphy of a site is the geographical equivalent of a fingerprint, unique to its specific location. Having found one box with this characteristic stratigraphy, the BRP archaeologists investigated the nearby boxes. They quickly realized that the boxes containing finds and reports with grids labeled S and L in one plane and 6 to -1 in the other plane were all associated with Bamburgh. While the BRP archaeologists were looking through the boxes, one of the RCA HMS staff brought Paul a suitcase and suggested he might find its contents interesting. Inside were 4 corroded pieces of metal. They had been found loose in the suitcase, so the conservators had wrapped them up in acid-free tissue paper. Picking them up and inspecting them, Paul quickly realized that 2 of the pieces fitted together, forming a whole broken sword. Another was the head of a broadaxe, and the 4th was also a sword, broken in 2. He was holding the upper half, including the tang, in his hands. There had been no labels with the finds, but the suitcase had been among the stuff from Bamburgh, so it was reasonable to assume that Hope Taylor had excavated them from the castle. Proof of that would depend upon them being able to find the details of Hope Taylor's finding of the swords and axe head in his site reports. But holding the broken-off sword, Paul was immediately struck by the suspicion that it had been no ordinary weapon. Swords are individual. Each is unique with its own set of characteristics, a style that it impresses upon the man wielding it, who in turn exerts his own style upon the sword. A sword is not a dumb brute of a weapon, but rather one that works in partnership with its wielder. Depending on the sword and the swordsman, the partnership may be one of equals, the sword may be superior to its wielder, or the swordsman may have to impose his own style upon a crude and poorly made weapon. The swords from the suitcase were not poorly made weapons. Paul was sure of that. But Hope Taylor apparently had not regarded them as anything special. He had certainly not labelled them as worthy of more attention. Gut instinct is a vital part of archaeology, but it is seldom mentioned in the literature. It's not possible to quantify or record, but the deep feeling some archaeologists have that this is the right place to dig, or that that artifact requires closer scrutiny, has been a major driver of many discoveries. While archaeologists might ascribe these instincts to the gut, it's more likely due to a combination of years of experience, deep familiarity with the period, and the employment of all the senses when assessing a landscape or object. Sometimes the sound of the soil falling from the trowel can be a vital clue. With swords, it is the feel, the weight, the life. A truly good sword feels alive in the hand, as if it is an extension of the body. Despite their sorry state, Paul got that feel from the two swords in the suitcase. But to determine if this sense was accurate, some tests needed to be done on the swords and the axe head. Dr. David Starley, archaeometallurgist at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds, was the perfect man to run those tests. Not only is he one of the best archaeometallurgists in the world, but he has a deep knowledge of ancient swords. What's more, he was prepared to run a full battery of tests on the finds, scanning electron microscope, photography, X-ray, and magnetic resonance. But all this testing takes time. The swords and the axe head, with the blessing of the RCA HMS and the custodians of Bamburgh Castle, were shipped off to the Royal Armouries Museum, while the BRP archaeologists tried to make some sense of Hope Taylor's Bamburgh site reports. The problem was that the grid system Hope Taylor had employed made no sense. S and L marked either ends of one axis, but no one knew what the S and the L stood for. They were not standard measures in archaeology, which usually employs the compass points for the basis of the grid system. For weeks they all puzzled over it, referring to Latin dictionaries, trying every sort of combination of compass fit that they could imagine. But none of these made sense. Then, standing on the castle battlements, looking out to the Farne Islands that sit low in the water 2 miles out from the land, Paul thought that the sea was unusually tranquil that day. He was looking at the sea from the land. S and L. That was it. S stood for sea and L for land. Looking at the site reports afresh, everything fell into place. Most importantly, it meant that the BRP could establish the context in which Hope Taylor had found the swords and the axe head. Finding the context meant that the swords and the axe head were no longer merely random bits of corroded metal, of some interest because of the way they had been forged but useless for archaeological purposes. Now they were finds that had their proper place in the unfolding story of early medieval Britain. Reconstructing the record of Hope Taylor's Bamburgh excavations was long, detailed, frustrating work. For over 3 years the archaeologists pieced together Hope Taylor's site record from photographs, site notebooks, and a very few accounts from people who had actually seen or dug the site as schoolchildren. It soon became obvious that there were huge holes in the archive, and much had been lost forever. It took the re-excavation of a Hope Taylor test trench to identify the location of the cache with accuracy. But finding the context did mean that the BRP could date when the swords were lost and how. The when was the 10th century, and the how was what Hope Taylor described as a catastrophic burning event. A devastating fire had burned down the building in which the swords were being kept, and they were lost in the wreckage. Broken swords, particularly if they were valuable and venerable, would often be reforged. The context of the site where Hope Taylor found the swords suggested a smithy to Paul. With the fire necessary for forging weapons and with buildings made predominantly of wood, uncontrolled fires were not uncommon in smithies. The two swords were probably awaiting repair and reforging in the smithy when a fire got out of hand. Amid the debris and ashes, the swords were lost for 1,000 years. However, until Paul got the report back from the Royal Armouries Museum, he could not say whether the swords had been worth reforging. They might simply have been broken swords, scrap metal that the smith was keeping on a shelf, waiting on some free time to forge them into something else. Archaeology is not quick. The four young archaeologists recognized that the excavations in and around the castle was an enterprise that would take many years to complete and many trowels to dig. With funds always a difficulty in archaeology, they realized that the depth, complexity, and stability of the site meant that they could combine training with digging, providing grit under the fingernails experience for archaeology undergraduates and to anyone interested in the deep past with 2 weeks to spare in the summer. So the dig became the Bamburgh Research Project, and it's still going on, digging down into the past and still making new discoveries after more than 20 years in the field, as well as helping to train the next generation of British archaeologists. For those who have not seen Bamburgh Castle, the stronghold sits atop an outthrust of the Great Wynn Sill, a layer of extra-hard dolerite stone that underlies much of the geology of the northeast of England. This dolerite was laid down 300 million years ago when a layer of liquid magma, rising from the Earth's core, was diverted before it could reach the surface and become a volcano. Instead, the rising magma found the gap between two layers of sedimentary rock and squeezed into the space. Imagine squeezing a tube of toothpaste into the space between two horizontal boards. It will spread out, forming a thin layer between the two boards, the thickness of the layer determined by how far apart the two boards are. The liquid rock did the same, spreading out and forming a layer that spread across what would become northern England and southern Scotland. In some places, of course, there was no gap between the layers, and the slow-moving liquid rock flowed around these places, creating a geological underscape that would have looked like the wetlands of the Scottish flow country when seen from above, flat but dotted with many pools and lakes where the magma had not been able to penetrate between the layers. Dolerite is a very hard rock, but the layers of carboniferous rock above and below it are much softer. Millions of years of erosion have gradually worn away the top layer of stone, reaching the dolerite underneath. Those areas that the liquid rock was not able to reach have continued eroding at a relatively faster rate, but where the dolerite has been exposed, it has resisted the forces of water and wind longer and harder, creating slabs and extrusions of hard, long-wearing rock in a broad band through the northeast. The local quarrymen knew the rock well and gave it its name, Wynn Sill, a name later adopted by the first geologists. The Wynn Sill stretches beyond Bamburgh to the Farne Islands a few miles out to sea, with each of the islands characterized by steep cliffs and flat tops. Bamburgh itself squats beside the sea. Nowadays there is a magnificent beach between the castle and the sea that, at low tide, stretches a good half-mile to the water's edge. But the beach is recent. It is a product of a storm of apocalyptic proportions in 1817 that dumped a beach worth of sand below the castle, having picked it up from further north and moved it south during the course of a few wild days. When the swords were forged, the sea washed up to the base of the rock at high tide. The rock itself rises 45 meters, 150 feet, above the surrounding land. It has a fairly flat top covering 9 acres in an elongated teardrop shape. The original entrance to the castle was what is now called St. Oswald's Gate at the top northeastern corner of the rock, the far side from the modern entrance. The entrance was probably placed there because it lies closest to an area of the beach that shows evidence of having been a landing site and mooring place for boats in the past, before the Great Storm of 1817 changed the topography of the area beyond recognition. With Bamburgh being on the coast and the road network slow and unsafe, most travellers would have reached the castle by boat, so it made sense for the main entrance to be close to the harbour. Atop the rock, over towards St. Oswald's Gate, the BRP archaeologists have found evidence of blacksmithing. The horizontal location given by Hope Taylor corresponds closely with the area where they found the blacksmith. The fire that caused the loss of the Bamburgh sword, whether from a local fire around the blacksmith's forge or a more general conflagration, did us the favour of ensuring that these old pieces of metal were forgotten and left to moulder in the ground until Hope Taylor found them. But from the way he had handled them, there was nothing to indicate that Hope Taylor realised that they were anything out of the ordinary, just a few pieces of old and rusty metal. It was Paul's gut intuition that these bits of metal were special that had led him to call on the Royal Armouries in the first place. And when Dr. Starley eventually called back, he confirmed that Paul's instinct about these bits of battered metal had proved absolutely correct. Both swords had been pattern-welded weapons of the highest quality. Pattern welding was how smiths attempted to compensate for impure iron. They took billets of different iron, forge-welded them together, and twisted them, producing the patterns characteristic of pattern welding. The broken sword with both halves was a pattern-welded blade made from 4 billets of iron, which put it on par with the sword excavated from the burial mound at Sutton Hoo in 1939. While the identity of the man buried in the ship at Sutton Hoo cannot be established with complete certainty, the most likely candidate was Redwald, King of East Anglia, and at the time of his death in the early 7th century, the most powerful king in Britain. So the broken sword that Hope Taylor had excavated, but put away, was a weapon of comparable quality to that wielded by a king. But the other sword, the one of which only half was found, had been even better. According to Dr. Starley, it was forged from 6 billets of iron, pattern welded together. It would have been a sword of incomparable quality, truly a sword that might have been welded by kings. Stylistically, the sword was created in the early 7th century. The deposition layer from which Hope Taylor had excavated it gave a date in the 10th century. Since it was unlikely that a broken sword would have been kept for hundreds of years, the sword must have been handed down through the generations as both an heirloom and a potent and powerful weapon. As for the axe, on any ordinary site it would be special. It was the head of a broad axe, scarf-welded, and used in the construction of boards and planks. Scarf welding is when 2 beveled edges are welded together. This type of axe is still used in shipmaking today, but the axe paled in comparison to the swords. As Paul listened to Dr. Starley, he realized that these weapons were truly extraordinary. The complete but broken sword was a match to the highest quality blade yet found in Britain. The half-sword stood in a category all of its own. Dr. Starley was telling Paul that he had never before examined a weapon of such quality. No one had yet discovered a sword made from 6 billets of pattern-welded iron. It was not just extraordinary, it was unique. As the telephone call finally ended, Paul sat down, almost winded by what he had been told. According to the archaeometallurgist of the Royal Armouries, the BRP had unearthed 2 of the finest swords ever forged. But in archaeology, context is everything. With Dr. Starley's dating putting the forging of the weapons in the first half of the 7th century, Paul could start to put the creation of these weapons into context. In the 7th century, Britain was a patchwork of warring kingdoms. In the 7th century, Britain was on the outer edges of the known world, a long way from the centres of power and wealth, clustered around the shores of the Mediterranean and in what would become France. In the 7th century, Britain was just emerging from 2 centuries when it had slipped from the pages of history and had become a place of legend and song. The Roman veneer of 4 centuries of imperial rule had been gradually rubbed away, and, in its place, was a country of mead halls and small villages, with few centres of population larger than a small town.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?